Teachability. No matter how much we know and understand, we are to be open to learn more about God's will and ways. Here now is Gene Getz.
This principle, of course, comes from the first chapter of the book of Proverbs. Most of Proverbs was written by Solomon, who, God himself says at one point that he was the wisest man in the world, at least from a human perspective. Certainly that does not include Jesus Christ because of who Jesus Christ was. But in the Old Testament setting, it was a very wise man, and he was given this wisdom because in a state of humility, he literally asked God how to lead the people of Israel. He didn't ask for wealth. He didn't ask for accumulation. He didn't ask for power. He asked for help, and God honored that humility. Now, here in the book of Proverbs, he penned 3,000 proverbs, most of them here. But he also composed 1,005 songs. Now, that's a lot of proverbs. That's a lot of songs. And God gave him the wisdom to be able to do that. And one of the things we have here is a principle right from the very beginning that says that if we are going to gain wisdom, we have to be teachable. We have to learn. And right from the very beginning, we have the purpose of Proverbs. And let's take a look at that, beginning actually in verse 1. The Proverbs of Solomon, son of David, king of Israel. I've already commented on this man. He made a great start. Unfortunately, he didn't end well. But that doesn't invalidate the fact that he spoke by the Spirit of God when he was walking in the will of God. Thankfully, God can use his word no matter what happens to an individual. And in this case, he went the wrong direction. But here we have those proverbs that God enabled him to write by the Spirit. The Proverbs of Solomon, son of David, king of Israel. And then notice all of the words that are used to describe this concept of wisdom, for learning what wisdom and discipline are. And then the number of words describing this wisdom, for understanding insightful sayings, for receiving wise instruction in righteousness, in justice, and integrity, for teaching shrewdness to the inexperienced. And we could say, being wise, as Jesus said, harmless as a dove and yet as wise as a serpent. Shrewdness to the inexperienced, knowledge and discretion to a young man. Now, the interesting thing is that he is addressing his thoughts to his son, who was a young man. But even though he was speaking to a young man, it didn't exclude young women. It certainly doesn't exclude anybody, whether we're young or whether we're old, whether we're men, whether we're women. Whoever we are as human beings, the Proverbs apply to our lives. They have uniqueness in their application, let's say, to this young man. But in that uniqueness, you see a universality as well in terms of what we can learn. And one of the first things he said, which relates to the principle here that I've shared with you, this enduring truth, is teachability. Teachability. A wise man will listen. Wow. What a profound statement. A wise man will listen and increase his learning. And a discerning man will obtain guidance. For understanding a proverb or a parable, the words of the wise and their riddles. And as I was thinking about that, I think you can imagine a continuum. And no matter where we are on that continuum, either as a young person growing older along this continuum, as we go into years, it applies that we ought to be learning always. Always being open, always being teachable. Because I think there is wisdom at a certain age. There is more wisdom as we grow older. More wisdom, more wisdom, more wisdom as we live through life. And that's God's plan. And then, of course, the whole challenge of applying the wisdom that we have. And unfortunately, Solomon becomes a positive example at the beginning and a negative example at the end in terms of being able to apply the knowledge that he had. And of course, there's a lesson in that. As I was thinking about an example of wisdom and growing in wisdom and having a teachable spirit, my mind went to an example in the New Testament, and it's a man by the name of Apollos, and we find the record in the book of Acts, chapter 18, and we're introduced to this guy here in verse 24. And let me just read this and unfold it so you get the background. A Jew named Apollos, a native Alexandrian, an eloquent man who was powerful in the use of the Scriptures, arrived in Ephesus. Now, there's a lot right there in order to gain the background. He was from Alexandria. Alexandria was an amazing city in Egypt, one of the largest cities in Egypt. It was noted for its university. It was noted for its golden library, one of the largest libraries in the ancient world. Apollos evidently grew up there. He was an Alexandrian. And it's obvious that he had been educated in a lot of wisdom from the library, from the university. We didn't know all about him, but he was a very brilliant man. And as we think about that, we see that his brilliance enabled him to be eloquent. He was powerful, but he's also powerful in the use of the Scriptures. So as a Jew, he evidently perhaps had gone to synagogue school. He had combined learning with his Hebrew background as well as with the secular background. And somewhere along the line, he had heard about John the Baptist and the coming of Jesus. And he arrived in Ephesus. Now, to understand that, we have to understand that the Apostle Paul spent 3 years actually lecturing in Ephesus. But as we read along, we meet a couple of other people. This man had been, that is Apollos, had been instructed in the way of the Lord. So he knew about Jesus. And being fervent in spirit, he spoke and taught the things about Jesus accurately. We assume he even understood, to a certain extent, salvation by grace. We're not told exactly what was missing in that dimension of theology, but it says he only knew about John's baptism. So he knew about John the Baptist, but he didn't know the end of the story. He began to speak boldly in the synagogue, and after Priscilla and Aquila, and here we have two people that are very interesting. They came from Rome. They were driven out of Rome because of Jewish hatred on the part of the emperor. They came to Corinth. They met the Apostle Paul, and they came to Christ. They were tent makers. In fact, Paul joined them there in tent making. And then when Paul went on to Ephesus, they followed him. So here they are, Aquila and Priscilla. They took him home. They heard him teaching, and they knew something was missing. And they explained the way of God to him more accurately. Now, he's a brilliant guy, but he learned more. And he was obviously very teachable. And when he wanted to cross over to Achaia, the brothers wrote to the disciples, urging them to welcome him. And after he arrived, he greatly helped those who had believed through grace. To understand the total message of salvation. So he's a great example. No matter what his brilliance, his background, his understanding, he was a learner. And I think that's a great illustration for what we have here in this particular principle. Now, the question for reflection and response is, why is Apollos a great model, particularly for Christian leaders? Well, let me say, first of all, as I've already indicated, it applies to every one of us. That principle applies to every one of us in terms of learning and being teachable. But it also applies in a very specific way, I think, to those of us who are called to study theology, who are called to study the Bible and to teach others. And you would think that the more we know about the Bible, the more we would grow in wisdom and humility and teachability. The sad part is that sometimes that doesn't happen, because pride can be a part of that process if we're not careful. The more we learn about God, the more humble we ought to become. But sometimes the more people learn about what God says, if we're not careful, Satan can use it to build us up in pride. So I think in a very special way, Apollos applies to every one of us, particularly those of us who are in ministry. Periodically, I have an opportunity to talk to seminary students. And I very openly share with them that when I was about 45, I thought I had a lot of answers. And when I was 55, I realized that through crises, some painful crises, that I had a lot more to learn about what I thought I knew. And then I jumped to the fact that, when I was 70, I really began to realize there's a lot more to learn. And now I'm in my 80s, and to be honest with you, it gets a little scary. Because the more we understand and comprehend of Scripture, the more we realize, if indeed we have open hearts, there's a lot we do not know about God and who He really is. So the principle applies, I think, in a very special way. Yes, to those of us in ministry, but to all of us. And here's the principle. No matter how much we know and understand, we're to be open to learn more about God's will and ways.